Hello, everyone, and welcome back. There are moments in life when the mind quietly shifts in ways we don't immediately understand. Today, we're exploring a subtle psychological change that many people experience but rarely talk about. The moment when emotions stop flowing the way they once did, and something inside begins to feel distant. There comes a point when your mind no longer reacts the way it used to. It doesn't happen suddenly. You notice it gradually. A message appears that once would have made your chest tighten, and now you just look at it blankly. Someone leaves, someone lies, someone disappoints you in exactly the way you feared they would. And instead of pain, there is silence. At first, you convince yourself this is growth. You tell yourself you've become stronger, more mature, less reactive, less naive, less dependent on others. But somewhere beneath that explanation, something feels off. Because real peace feels alive. This feels distant, almost cold. Slowly, you begin to notice unfamiliar changes within yourself. You can sit next to people you once cared deeply about and feel nothing at all. Conversations start to sound repetitive, predictable, almost artificial. Even laughter feels delayed, like your mind is imitating reactions it no longer truly experiences. And the unsettling part is, you remember who you used to be. You remember when music moved you, when words stayed with you for hours, when small moments carried weight. Now, everything seems to pass through you like smoke. The human mind doesn't simply collapse, it adapts, especially when emotional experiences become unsafe. Many people assume numbness comes from one major heartbreak or a single traumatic event. But more often, it builds slowly. One disappointment at a time. One moment of rejection. One experience where vulnerability was met with discomfort instead of care. Until eventually, the mind reaches a quiet conclusion. Feeling deeply is no longer safe. So it creates distance, not just from others, but from your own emotions. And this is where things begin to shift in a deeper way. Because emotional distance doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives intelligently. It disguises itself as independence. You stop expecting. You stop chasing. You stop explaining. You become easygoing, low maintenance. But beneath that, you are slowly becoming unavailable. Even to yourself. People might admire this version of you. They call you calm, composed, unbothered. But what they don't see is that this calmness is often emotional exhaustion in disguise. Because true suppression isn't obvious. You still function. You still smile, work, and talk like everything is normal. But internally, something has gone quiet. And sometimes, late at night, when all distractions fade, no music, no messages, no conversations, you feel it. That emptiness. That strange realization that you no longer know what truly moves you anymore. Most people don't become distant because they hate others. They become distant because they've experienced too much, too deeply. And once the mind begins to associate openness with pain, it starts protecting itself automatically, cutting off emotional connections before they can fully form. Not consciously, but instinctively. Over time, this numbness starts to feel safer than being fully alive. The mind protects itself by removing access, not just to pain, but to feeling altogether. And as this continues, your personality begins to shift in subtle ways. You reply less. You avoid deeper conversations. You stop explaining yourself because you assume you won't be understood. But more than that, you stop investing emotionally before anything even begins. That's the part most people miss. Emotional distance isn't just about being hard to read. It's about quietly rejecting connection before it has the chance to exist. You believe you're making logical choices. You tell yourself you've simply become selective. But often, your unconscious mind is still reacting to wounds that were never fully processed. One disappointment turns into an expectation. One betrayal turns vulnerability into something that feels dangerous. So the mind adapts through withdrawal. Not visible withdrawal, but internal. You are present, but not truly there. And people can sense it, even if they can't explain it. It feels like there's a part of you that remains unreachable. a closed space within you that no one is allowed to enter anymore. Ironically, this can make you appear more attractive. Emotional distance often gets mistaken for confidence. In a world where detachment is admired, people are drawn to those who seem unaffected. But what they're really seeing is not strength. It's emotional fatigue, a nervous system that has simply grown tired. And this creates a cycle. The more detached you become, the more controlled you appear. The more controlled you appear, the more people assume you're strong. And the more they see you as strong, the harder it becomes to show any vulnerability. So you continue to act indifferent, even when a part of you still craves connection. This is why emotionally distant people often feel the most alone, even in crowded spaces, because isolation begins internally. You can sit with others, laugh with them, even hug them, and still feel nothing inside. And over time, something deeper happens. You stop trusting emotions themselves, not just other people, but your own feelings. You begin to question everything about yourself, whether your reactions are real, whether your attachments mean anything, whether you're even capable of loving people the way you once did. And that uncertainty creates a quiet kind of existential panic, one that very few people ever talk about, because pain is something humans know how to endure. But the absence of feeling? That's different. That kind of emptiness turns life into something you observe rather than live, as if you're watching everything from behind glass. Over time, you start building coping patterns that look completely normal on the surface. Constant stimulation, overworking, endless scrolling, background noise, content filling every empty second, because silence becomes uncomfortable, almost threatening. Silence forces you to face what's been buried, and facing it risks waking up emotions you've spent years suppressing just to function. So you stay busy, not out of passion, but because movement keeps the emptiness from catching up to you. People often assume that emotionally numb individuals have mastered their feelings, but in reality, many of them are deeply afraid of what might happen if those emotions ever returned all at once. At some point, the numbness stops feeling temporary. It becomes part of your identity. You start describing yourself through absence. You say things like, "I just don't care anymore," or "I've always been distant." But the truth is, you weren't always like this. No one is born emotionally disconnected. Something teaches a person to become that way. And it rarely happens all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, through repeated experiences that might seem insignificant to others. A child reaches out for comfort and is ignored. A teenager opens up and gets dismissed or ridiculed. An adult finally trusts someone, only to be abandoned the moment they become inconvenient. The mind doesn't forget these moments, not logically, but biologically. And over time, the nervous system stops distinguishing between emotional openness and emotional danger. That's why emotionally numb people often appear calm in situations that deeply affect others. Their system learned long ago that shutting down is safer than reacting, but suppression always comes with a cost. Because emotions don't disappear when they're ignored. They move beneath awareness, and from there, they begin shaping behavior in ways you don't consciously notice. This is what Jung described as the shadow. Not the evil side of you, but the rejected side. The parts of yourself you buried because they once felt unsafe to express. Neediness, sensitivity, fear, loneliness, dependency, even love, especially love. So you build an identity around the opposite. You become self-sufficient, detached, unaffected, but those buried parts don't vanish. They wait, and eventually they surface indirectly. You might notice irritation toward people who express emotions freely, someone who laughs too loudly, cares too openly, feels too deeply, and instead of warmth, you feel discomfort. That reaction isn't random. It's not even judgment in the way it seems. It's grief. Disguised, because those people reflect something you once had, something you had to suppress to survive. And the mind has a tendency to reject whatever threatens the defenses it built. This creates a quiet, dangerous pattern. You begin resenting the emotional freedom you no longer feel capable of accessing. not consciously, but subtly. You watch others love without hesitation, while you analyze every interaction for risk. You see people cry openly while your body resists any release. You observe connections forming naturally, while your mind searches for hidden intentions behind every kind gesture. Once betrayal becomes internalized, trust starts to feel naive instead of natural, and emotional distance evolves into hyper-awareness. You become highly perceptive. You notice tone shifts, micro-expressions, inconsistencies in behavior. You can sense insincerity almost instantly. But at the same time, you struggle to accept genuine care. And this is where people misunderstand things the most. They assume emotionally distant individuals lack depth, but often it's the opposite. Many numb people didn't feel too little. They felt too much. So much that their system eventually shut everything down just to stay stable, like removing the batteries from a fire alarm that wouldn't stop going off. At first, the silence feels like relief, but eventually, you realize that the silence didn't just remove the noise, it removed the warmth too. And that realization changes everything. Because the most frightening part of numbness isn't the absence of pain. It's the gradual loss of aliveness, the inability to even recognize what might heal you anymore. Most people imagine emotional collapse as something visible, breaking down, crying, losing control. But some of the most internally disconnected individuals appear completely fine. They function. They maintain routines. They respond politely. They smile when expected. And yet, internally, they feel detached from everything, including themselves. That's what makes numbness so difficult to recognize. Pain is loud. Emptiness is quiet. It adapts. And eventually, it becomes so normalized that you start defending it. You convince yourself emotions are distractions, that attachment is weakness, that needing others is dangerous. But if you listen closely to people who glorify detachment, you'll often find something beneath it. Not freedom, but fear. Because true emotional stability doesn't avoid connection. It allows closeness without losing yourself. Numbness does the opposite. It avoids closeness entirely. One comes from security. The other comes from accumulated wounds. But modern culture often confuses the two. The less reactive you seem, the more powerful people assume you are. And slowly, a strange dynamic forms. People begin building identities around emotional unavailability. Coldness becomes something to admire. Detachment starts to look like status. Indifference becomes a kind of currency. Meanwhile, many are quietly losing touch with their own emotional core while calling it self-improvement. But the psyche doesn't work that way. What you suppress doesn't lose power. It gains it. The parts of you that remain unexpressed don't disappear. They stay beneath awareness, shaping your reactions, distorting your perceptions, influencing your choices. And eventually, they start showing up in indirect ways. Sudden irritation over small things, emotional exhaustion after social interaction, a strange inability to feel joy, even in moments that were once meaningful. You achieve something you once deeply wanted and feel nothing afterward. That moment is deeply confusing because you believed achievement would restore meaning. But numbness doesn't dissolve through success. The emptiness follows you, even into your victories. And slowly, a difficult truth begins to surface. Your emotional distance was never protecting your peace. It was protecting your wounds from being exposed. That's why control becomes so important. Control creates predictability. Predictability reduces vulnerability. And vulnerability risks emotional exposure. So you begin managing everything: conversations, interactions, outcomes. You analyze intentions. You keep emotional exits ready before anything gets too close. You don't enter relationships looking for connection. You enter looking for warning signs, and this is why emotionally numb individuals often disrupt healthy relationships without fully understanding why. Genuine care feels unfamiliar, and the mind tends to distrust what feels unfamiliar, especially if chaos once felt normal. So, when someone offers consistency, patience, or safety, the response isn't relief, it's suspicion. Because psychologically, familiarity feels safer than health, even if that familiarity was painful. That's how patterns repeat themselves, not through conscious choice, but through conditioning that operates beneath awareness. And over time, something even heavier happens. You begin to forget who you were before the numbness. You remember events, but not how they felt. You remember experiences, but not the emotional aliveness that came with them. The warmth, the openness, the softness. All that remains is functionality, survival. And when survival continues long enough, it slowly starts to feel like identity. The real tragedy is this. Those who feel nothing now are often the same people who once felt everything too deeply. They weren't born distant. They became that way after learning how easily emotions can be used against them. That lesson doesn't always come from one place. Sometimes it begins in family, sometimes in friendships, sometimes in love. But the message becomes clear over time. Honesty can be manipulated, vulnerability can be exploited, and caring more than the other person often ends in quiet humiliation. So the mind adapts. It stops trusting and starts studying. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Conversations are no longer entered with openness, but with awareness. You begin noticing dynamics instantly. Who is trying to dominate? Who is performing? Who is seeking validation? Who is hiding insecurity behind confidence? Observation begins to feel safer than participation. And over time, that awareness creates another kind of burden. You start seeing through people too quickly. The charm fades, the masks become obvious, the rehearsed personalities feel predictable. You begin to notice how many interactions are transactional, how often compliments carry hidden motives, how many relationships survive only because both people are silently pretending, and that realization creates a deep kind of exhaustion. Because once illusion fades, social life can start to feel mechanical. Words begin to carry meanings beneath their surface. I miss you can start sounding like I miss access to you. I'm proud of you can feel like you succeeded without me and that unsettles me. I care about you can feel like I need the role you play in my life. And the more aware you become, the harder it is to experience connection innocently. This is the hidden weight of perception. People often romanticize awareness, but deep awareness can isolate. Because once you begin to see how much of human behavior is driven by fear, you stop taking things at face value. Even kindness becomes something you analyze. You start asking quiet questions. Would they still stay if I stopped being useful? Would they care if I became inconvenient? Would they remain if I had nothing left to offer? These questions don't always come from paranoia. Sometimes they come from experience. And over time, they begin to erode emotional openness. This is where the internal split begins. One part of you still longs for real connection. Another part no longer believes it exists. So you live in contradiction, wanting closeness while resisting it, craving understanding while hiding yourself, desiring love while distrusting anyone who offers it. That contradiction is exhausting, and eventually some people stop trying altogether, not because the desire disappears, but because hope itself starts to feel dangerous. Hope invites vulnerability. Vulnerability brings risk, and risk threatens the emotional protection you spent years building. So you settle into something quieter, a controlled emptiness, a kind of emotional winter. What makes it more unsettling is how functional this state can be. You can build a career, maintain friendships, even stay in relationships, and still feel completely disconnected inside. Life continues, but it loses its color. Nothing breaks you anymore, but nothing truly reaches you either. And somewhere deep inside, a question begins to echo. Did life make you emotionally intelligent or just emotionally afraid? Over time, even the mask becomes difficult to remove, even when you're alone. That's when numbness reaches its deepest stage. Not when you stop feeling toward others, but when you stop feeling toward yourself. Life turns automatic. Wake up, work, scroll, sleep, repeat. Days blur together. Weeks disappear. Years feel like they passed without leaving any emotional trace. Because what gives time meaning is emotional presence. And without it, life collapses into routine. That's why emotionally distant people often feel like large parts of their life are missing. Nothing touched them deeply enough to leave an imprint. But beneath all that emptiness, something is still active. The unconscious doesn't go silent. It watches. It waits. It keeps trying to move you toward wholeness, even when you resist it. The emotions you buried never truly disappeared. They just changed form. Sadness becomes irritability. Grief becomes detachment. Vulnerability turns into superiority. Loneliness hardens into cynicism. The hidden parts of you always return, just wearing different faces. And if they're ignored long enough, they begin shaping how you see everything. You start expecting betrayal before it happens. You assume abandonment before distance appears. You question kindness before it has a chance to be genuine. Not because everyone is dangerous, but because your system no longer distinguishes between possibility and certainty. And this is where the deepest irony appears. The very mechanisms that were meant to protect you from pain begin destroying the connection you once needed most. Because underneath the numbness, many emotionally distant people are still deeply sensitive. They understand pain more than most, sometimes too much. That's why they withdrew, not because they lacked emotion, but because their emotions became overwhelming, too intense, too constant, too heavy to carry without shutting something down. From the outside, it looks like coldness, but internally, it's often overstimulation, exhaustion, years of emotional overload hidden beneath composure. For some, it began with one major betrayal. For others, it was a slow accumulation of smaller disappointments, moments that quietly taught the mind that emotional investment is never fully safe. And to be fair, the mind isn't entirely wrong. People do disappoint, they do leave, they do change. Love can become conditional. Attention can disappear. People can walk away when you no longer serve a role in their life. That is part of reality. But there's a deeper truth beneath it. Becoming numb doesn't remove suffering. It only removes your access to life itself. The pain doesn't disappear. It just goes underground. And buried pain doesn't stay quiet. It seeps into your decisions, your relationships, your sense of self, until eventually you're no longer sure whether you're protecting yourself or imprisoning yourself. And that realization changes everything, because the moment you see that your emotional armor is also your cage, the illusion begins to break. The detachment that once felt powerful starts to feel isolating. And for the first time, you begin to understand. This wasn't peace, it was distance. The silence doesn't feel calming anymore, it feels hollow. And maybe the most unsettling truth is this. Many people spend years trying to become emotionally untouchable, only to realize too late that invulnerability and isolation were never separate paths. They were the same thing, unfolding in different ways. Most relationships don't end because love disappears. They end when emotional safety disappears. And once the mind learns to associate connection with danger, it stops opening up entirely. Not because the desire for warmth is gone, but because survival has taught it to fear the very thing it once needed. That's the quiet horror of emotional distance. You don't notice the exact moment your heart closes. There's no clear line, no dramatic shift. One day, you simply realize that nothing reaches you anymore. Not love, not loss, not even your own presence in the world. And then, maybe one night, in complete silence, it hits you. You've spent years surviving, but almost no time actually feeling alive. The mind can endure that for a long time, but something deeper within you cannot. So before you leave, sit with this for a moment. When was the point you realized your numbness wasn't strength anymore, but exhaustion, quietly disguising itself as control? If this resonated with you, take a moment, not to respond, not to explain, just to reflect on what part of you still exists beneath the silence.